Good morning, and welcome to the National Archives, to those here in the audience and those online, and to our Fault Lines in the Constitution program. The National Archives preserves, protects, and makes available the valuable records of the federal government. And if you haven't already done so, I hope you take some time today to go upstairs to the rotunda and see the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the other amazing documents that we have here. Before we get started, I want to quickly mention a few of our other upcoming programs. On Wednesday, December 13th at 10 o'clock, we will have our next story time for preschoolers and their adult companions in the Boeing Learning Center. The theme for this month is exploring the Arctic, and participants will get to participate in group activities and make a craft. Join us back here in the theater at 7 p.m. on December 13th. Get your toes tapping to the sounds of the U.S. Navy Band Brass Quintet. And these are just a few of the many upcoming programs that we have. Be sure to check out our website and calendar of events for our full schedule. You are able to support great programs like this by joining the National Archives Foundation, and you can find more details online or in the lobby. At the conclusion of this program, we'd like to invite you to give us feedback, either by filling out a program evaluation or using our website and the QR code at the bottom of your program. We also hope that you'll join us for a book signing following the program outside the My Archives shop upstairs. Now I am honored to introduce Cynthia and Sanford Levinson. Sanford has been on the faculty of the University of Texas Law School since 1980, a member of the Government Department at UT Austin since 1984. He is author and editor of 15 books on the Constitution and other related topics. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, received a Lifetime Achievement Award for Law and Court Section of the American Political Science Association in 2010. He has written for a number of other general magazines and newspapers. Cynthia Levinson is a former teacher, education policy consultant, and researcher. Her multi-award-winning nonfiction books for young readers include We've Got a Job, the 1963 Birmingham Children's March, Watch Out for Flying Kids, How 2 Circuses, 2 Countries, and 9 Kids Confront Conflict and Build Community. The Youngest Marcher, the story of Audrey Faye Higgins, a young civil rights activist. In doing research for her book, she has ridden around in police cars, fallen off trapezes, a rolling globe, and a tightrope. She has interviewed a presidential candidate, but won't tell us which one. With their forces combined, they wrote Fault Lines in the Constitution, the framers, their fights, and the flaws that affect us today. Please give us a nice, warm welcome.
To the National Archives for allowing us to come today. We're very excited to be here. Thank you also to our publisher, Margaret Quinlan from Peachtree Publishers, who published this book, and to Kathy Landwehr, who is not here, our wonderful editor who has made this book what it is. So here is the cover of the book. And we would like to know, has anyone ever said to you, you could grow up to be President of the United States? Anybody could. If so, raise your hand. Mm-hmm. Oh, yep, okay. I see a couple people raise their hands. A lot of people say anybody can grow up to be President of the United States, and that's one of the benefits of our system. But there are a few problems. It's possible that not everybody who lives here can grow up to be President of the United States because there are certain requirements in the Constitution. For instance, you have to be 35 years old. Are you 35 years old? Mm-hmm. Not yet, but you will be. So that's okay. Check. You could be 35 years old and run for president. Let's try another one. You have to have lived in the United States for 14 years. Probably by the time you're 35, you'll have lived here for 14 years, right? That's good. But we have a question here. Where is the United States? Sandy, would you like to bring up that question?
Yeah, one of the things we talk about in the book is Puerto Rico, because a truly obscure clause of the Constitution says that you have to have lived within the United States for 14 years before you can run for president. So there are a number of exotic questions. What if, for example, you have lived abroad working for a multinational corporation, or there are all sorts of things that could take you abroad, but what if you're born in Puerto Rico? Is Puerto Rico within the United States or a territory out of the United States? I teach law, and this could be the subject of a full hour of discussion, which it's not going to be. But you should know that it's really an open question whether any of the American citizens in Puerto Rico, and everybody born in Puerto Rico is an American citizen, and if, as is happening actually right now, a number of people are moving from Puerto Rico to Florida and other places in the aftermath of the hurricane, they're certainly eligible if they live in Florida. Whether living in Puerto Rico would qualify constitutionally might turn out to be important someday. I mean, imagine somebody born and raised in Puerto Rico who lives in Puerto Rico until the age of 25. The person moves to the mainland at the age of 25, is a spectacular success, and at the age of 37 would like to run for president. And a lot of people think that'd be a terrific idea. Well, you know, any of us can do the math. 37 minus 25 is 12. So it'd be a really important question whether that person would have lived within the United States for 14 years, courtesy of the U.S. Constitution.
So that's one ambiguous, unclear part of the Constitution that we think is a fault line. You know, I didn't talk about fault lines. I was going to have you do that. Let me finish this, and then we can go back to the fault line. Sorry. So there's another ambiguous part. Every chapter in this book starts with a story. And one of the stories we tell is about Senator John McCain, who ran for president. But there was a question whether or not he was really eligible because of another part of the Constitution. And that is, the Constitution says you have to be a natural-born citizen. So, Sandy, what was the problem with John McCain?
Yeah, there are some people, I'm not one of them, but there are some people who believe that natural-born citizen means that you have to be born within the territory of the United States. It's, you know, it has overtones the same question of whether Puerto Rico is really in the United States or not. Senator McCain was born in 1934 in the Canal Zone, which is carved off from Panama. Ted Cruz, for that matter, who ran for president in 2016, was born in Calgary, Canada, to an American citizen mother. And there's no doubt that he was a citizen when he was born. But there were some people who say, well, no, he was born in Canada, that doesn't make him a natural-born citizen. Other people, of whom I'm one, says that if you're a citizen at birth, you count. But this also is and remains an open question in the sense that it's never definitively been decided by the court. Now, so this gets to the title of our book. What are fault lines? Well, fault lines is a term taken from the science of geology.
Maybe some people in our audience want to...
Yeah. It refers to the fact that all the continents, and for that matter, all of the oceans, because after all the water, there's land, rest on land. And beneath the surface, there are so-called tectonic plates which rest on top of one another. Most of the time we live our lives in complete ignorance of this. Our lives go on just fine. But some of you might have been surprised a couple of weeks ago when there was a genuine earthquake in Delaware. And most of us never think of the East Coast as being an earthquake zone. Why was there an earthquake in Delaware? Because the plates, the fault lines slip. And when the slippage occurs, then earthquakes can happen. And unlike the Delaware earthquake, other earthquakes can be catastrophic. And so we got the title for the book from the notion that there are parts of the Constitution which most of us, most of the time, probably ignore. They're not the topics of front page stories. I mean, what we're talking about right now, the requirements to be president, is not something that most people think about very much of the time. But every now and then it could turn out to be really, really important. And we have 18 fault lines that we talk about in the book. And some of them, if they slip, could really be catastrophic. And one could argue some of them have slipped in our 230 years and have been catastrophic. So that's really what the book focuses on. This one, you could say, practically speaking, is not the most important of the fault lines, which is true. But it's one that's actually fairly easy to understand once it's pointed out. And you can imagine circumstances under which it really could be very important. What if a court had said to the Republican Party, you can't nominate John McCain or you can't nominate Ted Cruz, independently of what you think of them politically? That's irrelevant, because they weren't born in a state of the Union. That brings up an interesting question for those of you from Washington, D.C., because Washington isn't a state either, but everybody kind of agrees that Washington is within the United States, but it's not clear about Puerto Rico.
So this is a fault line for several reasons that Sandy mentioned. One is that the meaning of some of the requirements for running for president are not clear. And another is maybe there are too many restrictions, in fact. This is a graphic from the book, and it points out that about a third of American citizens, who may well have been told when they were kids too, you could grow up to be president, maybe they aren't eligible because of these restrictions. So we do think that's a fault line. Now, one of the other things that we do in the book is that we explain how other countries and states in the Union deal with things differently.
Yep. Let me talk just one moment about states, because I think in many ways it's one of the most important aspects of the book. Most Americans, including a lot of lawyers, probably don't really appreciate the fact that they live under two constitutions, except in the District of Columbia, which is not a state. But each of the 50 states has its own constitution. And state constitutions are really interesting because all of the state constitutions are different from the United States Constitution in one or another important respect. And so Cynthia will turn to a really interesting difference between American state constitutions and other constitutions around the world and the United States Constitution.
Right. So first, going to other countries, does anybody know what country this is? France. Okay, so this is a map of France. Why do I have France here? Because in France, they don't have the same kind of restrictions on running for president of that country. There are two requirements. There may be more, but there are two basic ones. One of them is you have to be at least 18 years old. Oh, that's, pretty young. That's, almost half the age of 35. No, it's more than half the age, but not much, of running for president in the United States. Just 18. That seems pretty straightforward. The other one is a little strange. You have to have a bank account. We never quite figured that out, but to run for president of France, you have to be 18 years old at least and have a bank account, I think, in the country.
In France.
Yeah,
right.
In France. That's right. So Sandy talked about states. Well, states in America don't have presidents, but they do have executives. President is the executive officer of the United States. The executive in a state is, anybody know? Governor. Okay, governor. So different states have different requirements for running for governor. This is the logo, the campaign material from a man named Jack Bergeson, who is running for governor of the state of Kansas. And here is a picture of Jack and his running mate, Alex Klein. Alex is running for lieutenant governor. Kansas, it turns out, does not have a minimum age for running for governor. Jack is 16, Alex is 17. Only Alex next year will be old enough to vote for the two of them in the primaries when they actually run in the primaries for election, but they're doing it anyway. And this is the campaign material for Ethan Sonneborn, who is running for governor of Vermont. Vermont also has no age minimum for running for the executive office of that state. And here's a picture of Ethan. Ethan is 13, and he's running for governor. So now, when I've gone to talk to schools, and I show Jack's and Alex's, and especially Ethan's photographs, and people realize how young they are, well, we have conversations about that. We have a lot of discussions. I have not talked to either of them, but I have watched videos of them, and I've read their campaign materials. And I have to say, they are very knowledgeable, very articulate, and very impassioned about the reasons that they are running for governors. And in fact, Jack and Alex now have competition from other teenagers. There are two other sets. Jack and Alex are running for the Democratic ticket. The two other teenagers in Kansas are running for the Republican ticket.
Yeah, now, why is this important, other than, kind of an entertaining factoid? They're not going to be elected unless, remarkable things have been happening in American politics. But it's still extraordinarily unlikely that they're going to become governors of Kansas or Vermont. But, and this I think is really significant and not merely entertaining, my own personal strong hope is that they get to participate in the debates next year in Vermont and Kansas, because I actually think it would be very interesting and informative to listen to extraordinarily articulate 13 and 16-year-olds who are, for better or worse, going to be taking over the country as our generation, for better or worse, leaves the scene. And one of the things our book is about really is civic education. What do youngsters know? The book is written for teenagers. What do youngsters know about American politics? But again, it's not merely factoids. It's how the system works, and because of the fault lines, why the system quite often doesn't work very effectively, and the fault lines shift and produce even potential catastrophe. So I think it would be terrific if the then 14-year-old Ethan tells us what's on his mind, and if the then 17-year-old Jack tells us what's on his mind, because these are smart and aware kids. These are not jokes. But this couldn't happen at the national level because of a 25-year-old, a veteran of one of the wars we've been fighting endlessly. If a veteran wanted to run for the presidency, the first thing all of us would say is, you're too young. And what that means is not only that the 25-year-old veteran couldn't become president, and she couldn't, because the Constitution says clearly 35, but that we couldn't hear the voice of that veteran in a debate. Instead, it would be, quite frankly, old folks talking about the future of the country rather than youngsters. So this provision has some real consequences independently of the fact of whether or not Ethan or Jack will actually take the oath of office in 2019, where the answer is no, practically speaking.
So I'm curious, we do have some young people here. As you can tell, Sandy and I think it's a fault line in the Constitution that there is a 35-year-old minimum for running for president. And in fact, 48 of the 50 states do have age minimums for running for governor. But I'm curious what you think, whether you think you should have to be a certain number of years old in order to run for either governor or president. Anybody want to respond? You think there should not be an age minimum? No.
No.
Yeah. Because? Maybe it just doesn't seem fair?
Well,
Young kids know important things, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, what it does two things. First of all, it basically says we don't have anything to learn from kids. You've really got to be older. In the case of the United States Constitution, much older than a kid. Most states have 18, 21. I think one has 30. But all of the states have lower requirements. But it also expresses a certain mistrust for the voters. I mean, quite frankly, most of us would not really vote for a 15-year-old because I think most of us would say you really do need some experiences before becoming governor. But that's very different from whether or not there might be something to learn from the 15-year-old and the views of the country, to participate in the debate. And a lot of what our book is about is participation in politics and the importance of participation. And there, quite frankly, you can never be too young to begin participating in the political process and telling people, beginning with your parents, but going on well beyond that, you know, listen to me because I might have something to say, even if there are good reasons you're going to disagree with me. We can't really go to Disneyland this year, but you ought to at least hear me out on why that'd be a terrific idea. And then more importantly, to talk about, the government.
So Sandy mentioned that we have 18 fault lines in the book. You'll be glad to know we're not going through all of them, but we want to mention at least one more, and that is the Senate. When you learn about the Constitution, when you take a government class or an American history class, you'll learn that there are two houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in a lot of classes and most books about the Constitution, it just explains how the government is set up and how it works. What we talk about is the problems because of the ways that the way it's set up keep it from working very well. So the next fault line we want to tell you about is the Senate. And the Senate really has implications. Even though it was set up in 1787, 230 years ago, it causes problems for us today. If you in the last week ate a muffin, some pretzels, some cereal, a soft drink, raise your hand. Oh yeah, a lot of us. Okay, me too. So the problem, as you can see from this graphic in the book, is that a lot of what we eat, and in fact a lot of what we're with, has corn in it. In particular, a lot of what we consume has corn syrup in it. And there may well be corn products in the carpeting here or in the upholstery of the chairs that you're sitting in. The problem with corn syrup is there are several problems. One is it doesn't have any nutritional value. And another is that it has calories that aren't good for us. It adds calories to the food we consume. And those calories can make adults overweight, and it can also cause adults to get diabetes. So why is there corn syrup in so much of what we consume. It goes back to the Senate and how it was set up in 1787.
Right. There's a key difference between the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. The representation in the House of Representatives, there are 435 representatives. States get representatives based roughly on how many people live in them. So California gets, I think, 54 representatives. Wyoming gets 1. Larger states, larger number of representatives. It's very simple. That's not the way the Senate works. In the Senate, every state gets the same 2 votes. So California with 38 million people gets 2 senators. Wyoming with 550,000 people gets 2 senators. We could discuss whether that's fair, but that's not really the focus of the book, that is fairness or unfairness. Rather, the focus of the book is what difference does this make? And there are some very practical differences. It means that smaller states, where small is defined in terms of population, because some of the small states are very, very large in territory, like Montana or Wyoming, that small states get a lot of extra power in the Senate that they don't have in the House.
Can you explain how the, oh, okay, fine, okay.
This also means that the interests of small states will get extra clout. And it turns out that corn tends to be produced in a number of states in the American Midwest that have relatively small populations, but a lot of power in the Senate. Their senators, and it really doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives, that's really quite irrelevant. Their senators are passionately committed to the interests of the people who live in the states, which is fine. That's what we expect representatives to do. But the point is that the representatives of the corn-growing states in the Senate both care extremely deeply about this and have the basic political power to get handsome support for corn farmers that senators from larger states can't really effectively oppose.
So how did this come about? This started in 1787 as a compromise among the guys, and they were all guys, and they were all white guys, in Philadelphia when they got together at a convention to write the Constitution. Now, at that point in America, 230 years ago, a third of the people lived in 2 states, Virginia and Pennsylvania. Only a 90th of the people in America lived in the teeny tiny state of Delaware. So when these guys, we call them the framers because they framed the government, they framed the Constitution, when these guys got together and they were deciding there were going to be 2 houses in this Congress to make laws, the House of Representatives and the Senate, they agreed that there would be, in the House of Representatives, as Sandy said, more people there from big states, fewer people there from small states. But then they got to this other house, the Senate. And that's where things really nearly fell apart. In fact, we probably would not have one country. We would probably not have one constitution for this one country if they had not agreed reluctantly, after a lot of debate and argument, to give every state 2 senators. So even though a third of the people lived in Virginia and Pennsylvania and only a 90th of them lived in Delaware, Delaware got 2 senators the way Virginia and Pennsylvania did, because Delaware said, we're just going to pack up and go home. Right. We don't need to be a part of your country if you're not going to let us have our 2 senators.
Right. James Madison, who is sometimes called the father of the Constitution, was not at all happy with this feature of his child. in an essay he wrote in something called The Federalist. He referred to the Senate as a lesser evil. There are two important words. One is evil. He thought that it simply was unfair that Delaware and Virginia had the same number of senators. But it was a lesser evil because he thought that it was the price that had to be paid to get the Constitution at all. It's a lot like slavery, which was also a compromise. And we live with this today, the consequences today, and that's one of the points of the book.
So, consequences today. So today, our country, more and more people live in bigger and bigger cities. So today, less than half the country has about 308 million people in it. Less than half of them, about 150 million, are spread across 41 states. And those 41 states get a total of 82 senators. More than half the population, 158 million people, are kind of converged into a small number of states with big cities, only 9 states. And they only get 18 senators. So that means that more than half the country is represented by only 18%. That's less than a fifth of the US Senate. Whereas less than half the country gets 82 votes in the Senate. So we definitely think that that is a fault line. One of the stories that we tell in the book is about the USA PATRIOT Act and the money that was given to the states after the events of 9/11, September 11th, 2001, and how small states got more money per person than large states because it was a governor from a small state, Patrick Leahy, who decided how the money should be spent. Excuse me, Senator. Thank you, Senator. Decide how the money should be spent, and that really carries on even to today. So in 2013, because of the way, in part, because of the way the Senate is organized, California receives less money per person from the federal government than smaller states do. California is the biggest state. They get $1,430 per person to spend on things like roads and bridges and money to help poor people in the state and money to help sick people in the state. Whereas Vermont gets about twice as much per person for those same reasons. So that's another way that we think that there is a fault line in the Constitution that goes all the way back to 1787, 230 years ago. The decisions that the framers made, they had to make them because we would not be one country. But the results are that today there is unfairness in how this works out.
Right. It's also appropriate, since we're speaking in Washington, and there's not time to go fully in it, but we have a chapter on District of Columbia and talking about no taxation without representation, or in this instance, heavy taxation without representation, because I think residents of the district pay a lot of tax revenues to the national government, but there's no home rule in the district. Congress continues to exercise authority over the district in important ways. People who live in our nation's capital have no representation in the House, no voting representation in the House. They have nobody in the Senate. Same is true of Puerto Rico, though at least people in Washington can vote for the presidency. But the practicality, and the real point we're making is not the abstract point of fairness or unfairness. The real practicality is that it's very important to have a champion fighting for you with a vote in the Senate. And if the district has no champions riding their horses, then Congress, at the end of the day, isn't going to care very much about the District of Columbia or about Puerto Rico, or the Senate in particular will care much, much more about the 41 smaller states than they will about the 9 large states, because 82 really is impressively more than 18.
Yeah. So we do have lots more fault lines we talk about in the book. Probably one of the most famous ones that a lot of people are aware of is the Electoral College, how we elect our president, which is not by direct vote. We have to go through other people. And as in this past election, it sometimes happens that the person who wins more votes doesn't become president. The person who wins less popular votes does because of the Electoral College. We talked about what I call gerrymandering, what Sandy calls gerrymandering, and how that relates to the Constitution. There are problems about what happens if the president gets very, very sick and can't serve. Now, there is a line of succession in the Constitution about who becomes president, but sometimes that can be problematic. Do you want to give just one quick example?
Well, it's hard to make it quick because we talk about 2 different possibilities. One of them is true catastrophe, where one imagines an airplane crashing into the Capitol and killing or disabling lots and lots of representatives or senators. That would be a catastrophe not only with regard to the people who are the victims of the attack, but the fact that the Constitution makes it impossible quickly to reconstitute a functioning government. But what Cynthia is also referring to is what if, as happened in 1919, almost 100 years ago, the President of the United States has a significant stroke, which really and truly disabled him from functioning effectively as president. You know, it didn't matter. He hung on, I think it is, till 1921. His wife more or less ran the White House during that period. Other presidents have had heart attacks and strokes. And the Constitution really originally didn't speak to this at all effectively. We have a 25th Amendment, which might be able to become effective, but we talk in the book that the 25th Amendment in its own way is its own fault line. For one thing, it's totally unclear what happens if the president turns out to be mentally debilitated rather than physical debilitation. It's easier to understand strokes and heart attacks than it is to understand certain sorts of mental instability. So we talk about that as well.
And we talk about what happens if there's, say, a whole bunch of people in the country or in the government come down with, oh, I don't know, the plague, and can't serve. And we talk about how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. In the end of the book, we give the Constitution a grade. Now, those of you who go to school, when you get a grade, say on a test or a project that you've done, your teacher has probably told you what he or she expects you to do. Here's what the assignment is, here's what I'd like to see you do, and I'm going to grade you on it. So we have reasons, we have background standards for grading the Constitution, and it's the preamble to the Constitution. That's how we grade it. So the preamble reads, "We, the people of the United States, in order to
form a more perfect union."
establish justice,
ensure domestic tranquility,
provide for the common defense,
promote the general welfare,
and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America.
So this is the point of the Constitution. The point of the Constitution is not to elect a president. It's not to have a Senate. It's not to have a Supreme Court. Rather, you assess all of these institutions and the way the Constitution operates more generally by whether or not they enable us to achieve the really and truly inspiring goals that are set out in the preamble. There's a lot in our book that is critical of the Constitution. That's, the whole focus on fault lines is designed to worry you a bit. But the preamble is really terrific because all of us should be proud that we live in a country that is devoted to really admirable things. But then the question is to what extent the Constitution might present its own problems, especially after 230 years of experience, with regard to achieving the really wonderful goals, the lesson plan that is set out in the preamble.
Mm-hmm. And we invite you to grade the Constitution. We ask you, when you've read the book, to think about how well you think the Constitution helps us as a country, meet these goals. And here's a report card that you can do that with. We do not give the Constitution an A, as you can imagine, but we invite you to see the grade that we do give and why we give it, and we hope actually that you'll disagree with it. Because in fact, we blog about the book, which I'm going to tell you about in just a minute, and you can tell us what you think. But the real question is, now what? Here we are, we've got this Constitution. It has wonderful goals. We think it has some fault lines that prevent the country from meeting those goals. What can we do now? We especially love this comment from Michael Che, which I'll let you read. And being grandparents ourselves, we are sympathetic with the idea of taking grandpa out or grandma out and figuring out what we're going to do now
Right.
with this Constitution. Well, Sandy and I actually have a debate. There's an audio version of the book, and you can hear us debating if you listen to the audio version of the book, or you can read in the book about our debate. Sandy thinks that what we need to do about the Constitution now is
have a new constitutional convention, as is authorized by Article 5 of the Constitution, which is the provision of the Constitution dealing with constitutional amendment.
I think that's a dangerous proposition, not just because of what might come out of a constitution. Who knows what kind of government we might end up with. But I'm concerned about the fact that even though Article 5 of the Constitution does allow for another convention, there's absolutely no description or explanation or guidelines about how the convention itself would be set up. Who would go? How many people? What power would they have? How would they vote? Would they be able to change the whole Constitution or just some of the Constitution? What about the things we don't like or other people do like? I worry that we would get into so many debates and arguments about how to hold this Constitution, this convention, that we wouldn't even be able to get to the point of having one.
But let me make one other point where we certainly agree. Mm-hmm. And it's especially, I think, important at the National Archives, which is one of its central exhibits is the text of the Constitution, which is treated really, along with the Declaration of Independence, as a sacred document within within the United States, which in many ways it is. And we talk about the founders, we usually capitalize the term, as if they're really special people, which is also true. But it's extraordinarily important to recognize that the founders or the framers did not believe that they had gotten it exactly right. If they had, they wouldn't have included Article 5, which talks about amendment, because Cynthia certainly doesn't oppose amending the Constitution. Our debate is the wisdom of having a convention. But the point is that you're not disrespecting the framers if you say it's important actually to assess what they did. And one of their favorite terms, which they used over and over again, especially in the Federalist, which is the principal defense of the Constitution, they love the term the lessons of experience. And if you read the debates in Philadelphia, they're constantly referring to the lessons of experience from what happened in England, what happened in the various American colonies, and saying we should learn from this. So we're not honoring the framers if we treat them as what are sometimes called demigods and say, you know, they did all of our thinking for us. All we need to do is to celebrate the Constitution rather than to think about the extent to which it might have some problems. And so we should have the same courage that the framers did to think about the practical problems and do something about it.
Those are great points. So I mentioned that we're blogging about the book. One of the points of the book is that what happened 230 years ago really does affect us today. The book, so we are updating it twice a month. We continue to show how current events, current issues, relate back to the Constitution and what happened in Philadelphia 230 years ago. You are welcome to sign up for the blog. There's a sign-up sheet in the lobby. And we are holding a competition, a blog a fault line contest. This is for school kids and teachers. Kids can write their own blog post about a current event and how it relates to the Constitution, and send them to me. I will read them along with my editor, and we'll take a look at them. And the winners, there will be winners for younger kids and winners for older kids, will get their post, their blog, posted on the website, and their school will get a Skype visit from Sandy and me to talk about this. Well, how much more time do we have, Amber? Okay, so we welcome questions, and I understand people with questions need to go to the microphone. Is that right? Or if that's not easy for you, then I'll be glad to repeat the question.
I'm delighted to say this is being streamed on YouTube, and we welcome anybody who is watching this either this morning or at 2 in the morning on a hyperlink. But it really would be wonderful to get some questions or comments.
And you're also welcome to make comments on the blog, which is at www.faultlines.com, or to email us. You can go to my website, www.cynthialevinson.com. And also, students who are here, older people who are here, who want to come to the lobby afterwards, we'll give you a sticker that the publisher developed that we just love that says, I am constitutionally literate, because, of course, now you are. So, questions?
Hi, I'm Kevin McGowan, and I was just kind of fascinated by your idea about convening another constitutional convention. I was just wondering if you could elaborate that on what you see, how that might be organized, and how you see it might be how it might be run.
Sure. First of all, let me say that most of my family and friends and professional colleagues at law school disagree with me, and they agree with Cynthia about the unwisdom of having a new convention. I remain persistent, though, in supporting it. But I think Cynthia makes the strongest argument against it, which, ironically or not, is the fact that the Constitution gives no guidance whatsoever as to how it will be organized. And so there is actually a very active movement right now, generally sponsored by the political right, to have a new convention where state legislatures are passing petitions to Congress to call a new convention. Most of the people who support this believe that the states themselves would name the delegates and that the voting rule would be one state, one vote, so that Wyoming and California would have the same voting power. I think for a variety of reasons that's insane. But I also think that it would never establish general support among the public if you saw that happening. My own proposal, maybe this is, if you're going to hang for a lamb, you may as well hang for stealing the whole flock, is that I would select 700 delegates or so at random in a nationwide citizen jury. There would be very modest controls. There would obviously have to be some sort of age limit. I love the idea that a 13-year-old is running for governor, and I'd be delighted to have some teenagers as delegates chosen at random. But I wouldn't want our 5-year-old granddaughter, our 6-year-old granddaughter to be one of the delegates, so there would have to be some age limit. You would also want to control against the statistical possibility that every one of the 700 people would be from simply one part of the country. But otherwise, that's the way I would staff the convention. It would be on C-SPAN. And again, one can say for better or worse, because frankly, we got the 1787 convention only because it was in secret. Nobody knew what was happening. The deals, nobody was in the room where it happened, which is a song from Hamilton we quote in the
regard
book.
to District of Columbia.
And it's easier to make deals where people aren't looking over your shoulder. That couldn't happen in the world we live in. But in any event, this is how I would organize it. The fact that it would be on C-SPAN and many other outlets would, I think, generate all sorts of public debates, dining room tables, bars, meetings, and lead to a national conversation that we're not having. And part of what our book is about is trying to encourage a national conversation about fault lines that we're not having. People shout at one another all the time about rights provisions in the Constitution. What does freedom of speech mean? What does the Second Amendment mean? What does equal protection mean? Our book really isn't about that. Our book focuses on structural details of the Constitution that really don't lend themselves to controversies about what they mean. What part of two do you not understand with regard to how many senators each state gets? Rather, the question is, in the 21st century, are we well served by some of the decisions made in 1787? That's the conversation we should be having, beginning with teenagers who are going to take over the country.
Question here. Does where in the Constitution, if it does, it address specifically presidential pardoning powers? Because this has always seemed to me something like a sovereign of a non-democratic country, a king or queen would have. And particularly in light of current circumstances, pardoning powers in relations to oneself or their family members.
Yes. That's very interesting you bring that up. I think we are going to have to blog about that soon, frankly, because it is a fault line that we didn't think about when we were writing the book. And I think we're going to need to enter it into the conversation.
Yeah, as our publisher knows, we were revising the book literally up to the day that it went to press. If we ever have the opportunity to do a second edition, I don't know that there will be a full chapter about the pardoning power, but there will certainly be a sidebar about it, because it's really, really interesting. You can, in fact, compare it to the powers of the king or queen, but my own view, actually the pardoning power is discussed at some length. I think it's in Federalist 74. And there are good reasons for a pardoning power. Now, if you look at state constitutions, you discover that a lot of them have commissions. They don't trust the single person of the governor. They'd rather give it to a commission, which makes sense. But the most interesting defense of the pardoning power has very little to do with mercy. That is, somebody got an excessive sentence or really did reform him or herself in prison and should get a second chance. That's interesting, but actually not the most interesting. The most interesting discussion of the pardoning power involves the very first use of the pardoning power by George Washington, where he pardoned people who had engaged in the Whiskey Rebellion, which was a real rebellion. He got on his horse and went to Pennsylvania to face down people who refused to pay taxes on whiskey. Taxes have always been. I mean, it's not merely that Americans don't want to pay taxes without representation. Frankly, most Americans don't want to pay taxes with representation. So, the first near civil war occurred, I think, in 1790 or 91. It's called the Whiskey Rebellion. They clearly could have been viewed as committing treason. Several were convicted and I think sentenced to death, and George Washington pardoned them. And he was right to pardon them because the point was to bring them back as full members of the country that really did have to get up and running. John Adams pardoned some people in an even more obscure Freeze Rebellion. Jimmy Carter pardoned and gave amnesty to, I forget how many thousands of people went to Canada to resist the draft during Vietnam. Gerald Ford famously or infamously for some pardoned Richard Nixon in order to end the national nightmare of Watergate. All of these are controversial. It's not that they're open and shut, but they are the most important examples of presidential pardons. But if we had the chance to rewrite the book or add the book, I assure you there would be a discussion of the pardoning power, because it is a really, really interesting feature, and a lot of us today, more than was the case even 8 months ago, would ask whether or not the pardoning power is a genuine fault line, because the Constitution presents no limits to presidential pardons. And lawyers can argue with one another as to whether presidents can pardon themselves. Usually we regard that as merely the worst form of academic argument because it's not going to happen. But now one might wonder. And the Constitution, frankly, doesn't provide much help with regard to answering questions like that.
Do we have time for another question, Amber?
Do I need it? I'll talk loud.
I think for the
Okay. Hi, I'm Pat Quinlan. I just was wanting to know your thoughts on the Electoral College and if you think it's good, bad, and if it might ever be abolished.
The longest chapter in the book is on the Electoral College. In fact, it forms a whole part of the book, which kind of drove Kathy, our editor, crazy because every other part has multiple chapters. But this one is so complex, both in its origins and in how it's played out over the years, that it really sustains kind of a bulk in the early part of the book. One of the things that we say is that the Electoral College worked fine as long as George Washington was president. But in the very next election, after he decided not to run for a third term, things fell apart for various reasons. For one thing, the framers didn't plan on, in fact, they tried to prevent the development of political parties. So partisan politics right away gummed up the works in regard to the Electoral College. We do explain why it came about, and there were good reasons at the time. There were no media as we know of it then, as we know of it today, back then. So somebody living in South Carolina would have no idea who might be running for the position in, say, Pennsylvania, coming from Pennsylvania. But they figured the knowledgeable, wise people in their state who, traveled elsewhere or were in touch would know whom to vote for. So local people would vote for those people, and those people at the top of this Electoral College would actually be the voters for the presidency. It seemed to make sense at the time, although really the details of the Electoral College were rushed together in kind of a garbled fashion, very short order, near the end of the convention.
Yeah. You also can't understand the Electoral College historically without understanding the extent to which it is linked with the other most important compromise in 1787, which nobody ever refers to as the Great Compromise. Only the Senate gets the capital G, capital C. But the other compromise had to do with slavery. And the Electoral College is linked with enhancing the power of slave states. And one of the features of the Electoral College even today that is very important is that there's no incentive for any given state to run up the popular vote. The incentive is for the people who control the politics of any given state to minimize the vote of their political opponents. Because the way the Electoral College works is that you get the electoral vote simply by coming in first in that state. And if you win 100 to 50, that's just as good as winning 100,000 to 99,000. And in fact, 100 to 50, you're much more confident you can win. So voter suppression is a genuine problem in the 21st century. And I think it would be a significantly smaller problem if we had popular election rather than the Electoral College. But then there's a question, well, why haven't we gotten rid of the Electoral College given that every single poll since 1944 has shown that a majority of Americans believe the Electoral College is a mistake.
And most political candidates, too, want to get rid of it.
Right.
Sorry, but go ahead.
But so why do we have it? Why do we still have it?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to get rid of because it's so entrenched in the Constitution. There are workarounds, but the workarounds actually, one of them has to do with what's it called, a national vote?
Right.
Which would stipulate that once a number of states agree to this arrangement, then those states' electoral college votes would automatically go to the winner of that state's...
Of the national vote,
right,
not the state vote.
Right, that's right, of the national vote. But that might end up with, say, California having to throw its electoral college votes to a Republican, which they might not, or Texas throwing its electoral college votes to a Democrat. And,
right. And it's quite possible that neither the Democrat nor Republican would get a majority of the vote. They'd simply come in first. Right. And so if one talks about modifying the way you elect presidents, one of the conversations we should have is whether we want to have a system that more or less guarantees that the winner will have the support of the majority of the electorate, And here we talk about France or the state of Georgia, both of which have runoffs, as against simply giving the office to the person who comes in first. But when Cynthia talks about entrenchment, what she's talking about, and we have a chapter on this in the book, is how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. I mean, we could talk about convention versus amendment, but the fact is that Article 5 makes it extraordinarily difficult to amend the Constitution. And here's where the Senate becomes crucial, because though there have been 600 amendments proposed to get rid of the Electoral College, they die in the Senate. And interestingly enough, they die in some circumstances because small states want to preserve what they think are the advantages they get from the extra representation they get in the Electoral College as against what would happen if we simply had a single national vote. But also so-called battleground states tend to like the Electoral College because candidates campaign and spend their money only in about a dozen of the 50 states. Cynthia and I split our time between Massachusetts and Texas. Let me tell you, in Texas, if all we had to go on were the television stations and advertising in newspapers, we wouldn't know there was a presidential election going on. In Massachusetts, the only way we know there's a presidential election is because New Hampshire is part of the
media market.
Of the media market. In Florida, you can't escape the candidates. Same thing is true in Ohio. They're there all the time. And that has perverse consequences. It's not simply a question of fairness, unfairness. It also has perverse consequences in what kinds of issues are focused on by presidential candidates and which aren't. Most large American cities are in what might be called taken for granted states. And presidential candidates, whether Democrats or Republicans, really doesn't matter. Presidential candidates rarely make cogent speeches about urban policy because, frankly, there's not much electoral payoff in it. They make speeches about steel tariffs in Ohio or about policies that are of special interest to retirees in Florida. You know, I don't dismiss the importance of steel workers in Ohio or retirees in Florida, but this is one of the ways the Constitution structures our political discussion, and I think is a fault line.
Are we out of time? Oh, maybe we can talk more after.
Thank you guys so much for coming tonight, and we hope that you will join us upstairs for the book signing following the program. Have a great afternoon.